On the morning of June 24th, 2006, a 47-year-old man named Gilbert Gilman pulled his 2005 Ford Thunderbird convertible into the parking lot at Staircase Ranger Station in Olympic National Park in Washington State. As he parked, the music coming from his car was so loud that it had caught the attention of park ranger Sandy Lustig, who walked over to ask him to turn it down. When Ranger Lustig approached Gilbert, he noticed that Gilbert was dressed in a bright blue and green Hawaiian shirt, khaki pants, and sandals. He had a camera with him, but no backpack, which suggested to the ranger that Gilbert was just planning on a casual walk rather than some long, serious hike. And after their brief conversation about the music, Gilbert turned it down, and the ranger watched as he appeared to prepare for a short hike, likely on the Staircase Rapids Loop Trail, which was a very popular 2.1-mile trail that followed alongside the North Fork Skokomish River. The following day, when Gilbert failed to show up for a meeting in Spokane with his boss, Sandy Matheson, Gilbert was reported missing. Well, a few days later, authorities found his Thunderbird still parked at the Staircase Ranger Station, but there was no sign of Gilbert anywhere. Now, for context, Gilbert was more than just an ordinary guy. He had an incredibly impressive background. He was an ex-Army paratrooper who had served with the 82nd Airborne in places like Panama, East Africa, and Israel. He'd been awarded 2 Bronze Stars for his service, and on top of that, Gilbert had worked as a military interrogator in Iraq and had been involved in counterterrorism and counterintelligence operations. Gilbert was also highly educated. He had degrees from Union College in New York, the London School of Economics, and the Solvay Business School in Brussels. He was also fluent in Arabic, Russian, and Chinese, so this was clearly a very intelligent man who had spent a significant amount of time in very dangerous situations and difficult terrain. So when he went missing, authorities launched a massive search operation that went on for 10 days. They had quite a few people. I mean, we're talking 62 on the ground. They had brought in tracking dogs. They had a helicopter flying overhead, and they even used a plane equipped with heat-seeking FLIR technology. They searched the Staircase area trails, the surrounding ridges, really steep rocky hills, dense forestry, and all along the North Fork Skokomish River. But despite such an exhaustive search, they found nothing. There was not a single trace of Gilbert Gilman. It was like he had simply vanished. And so after those 10 days, the U.S. Forest Service officially declared Gilbert lost, and they called off the formal search. As you can imagine, when someone with Gilbert's background vanishes, people start coming up with all sorts of theories. And in 2008, a local TV station, Cairo TV, ran a story suggesting that Gilbert had led a mysterious life, even highlighting his previous top-secret military intelligence assignments. This was actually the first time anyone had publicly mentioned the theory that Gilbert might have intentionally disappeared to go work covertly for the US government. And it's not just a conspiracy. I mean, Gilbert's own mother seemed to believe this very theory, thinking that maybe he had become some kind of spy and had to vanish. But in 2014, there was an episode of a show called Dark Minds, and it suggested Gilbert might have actually been a victim of Israel Keyes, who was a known serial killer. Keyes had lived in Washington State since 2001 and had been issued several overnight backcountry permits for Olympic National Park. He was known to target victims while hiking and camping in various remote locations in this area. And interestingly, on the day Gilbert vanished, Keyes was actually competing in a marathon in Port Angeles, which is also on the Olympic Peninsula, not far from the park. Keyes was eventually arrested in Alaska in 2012 for the murder of an 18-year-old girl, and he later committed suicide while in custody. However, in March of 2014, an FBI special agent named Kevin Donovan made an official statement saying that after they had reviewed all the evidence and unsolved cases, they determined that Keyes was unlikely to have ever been involved in Gilbert's disappearance. So we really only have a few possibilities. One is that Gilbert got lost on the trail, which is possible, but it seems unlikely given that the staircase loop trail is short and very well marked, and aimed at people who aren't experts in the outdoors. And Gilbert was clearly very experienced. I mean, there's another possibility that he intentionally disappeared to work for the government. I mean, it's not exactly a stretch. And there's also the possibility that he was a victim of Israel Keyes, despite what the FBI said, or some other unknown assailant. Or maybe he had some kind of accident in a location that searchers couldn't access, and his body was carried away by the river or even hidden by the terrain. What we do know is that on August 27th, 2015, Gilbert Gilman was declared legally dead. Under Washington state law, a person has to be missing for at least 7 years with an absence that is not satisfactorily explained after diligent search or inquiry to be declared dead. And so in June of 2015, Gilbert's mother, Doris Gilman, petitioned the Thurston County Superior Court to become the official estate trustee with the authority to close her son's estate. But here we are, years later, after Gilman walked into Olympic National Park, and folks, we still have no idea what happened to the man. As his mother, Doris, said this, "It's hard to imagine a person can just disappear. Nothing was ever found." On the afternoon of January 7th, 1948, a 25-year-old fighter pilot named Thomas Mantell was flying his F-51 Mustang fighter plane over Kentucky. He was with 3 other pilots from his National Guard squadron, and they were on their way back from a routine training exercise, just heading home to their base in Louisville. Mantell was an experienced pilot, a decorated World War II veteran who had even received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions during D-Day. He was just expecting a normal flight home when, suddenly, the radio in his cockpit crackled to life. Mantell's assumed that it's probably just routine communication about landing instructions or something, but instead, it was from the control tower at Godman Army Airfield at Fort Knox, asking if Mantell and his buddies had enough fuel to help investigate something weird that was happening in the sky. What Mantell didn't know was that earlier that day, around 1 p.m., people all over central Kentucky had started calling the state police about this strange object they were seeing up in the sky. We're talking people from towns that were over 100 miles apart, all describing the same thing. A huge circular object, supposedly about 250 to 300 feet across, hanging there, not moving like a normal aircraft would. So when these reports reached Godman Field, a technical sergeant named Quentin Blackwell was on duty in the control tower that day, and he did what you'd expect. He called the regional flight service to check if there were any experimental aircraft or anything like that in the area. But they told him no. Nothing unusual was scheduled for the day. So Blackwell walks over to the tower window and starts scanning the horizon. And after a few moments, he spots this faint white speck far above the tree line to the southwest. So he grabs a pair of binoculars, and sure enough, there's this large, round, whitish object just sitting against the blue sky. Now, Blackwell's utterly confused at what he's looking at. It doesn't look like any aircraft or weather balloon he'd ever seen, and so he calls over another tower operator, Private Stanley Oliver, to confirm what he's seeing, and Oliver sees it too. Word starts spreading around the base, and by around 2:20 p.m., even the base commander, Colonel Guy Hicks, had come up to the tower to look at this thing through the binoculars. Now, Hicks would say something interesting. Later, he would admit that it looked like an ice cream cone or parachute shape with a reddish hue, and it appeared metallic, reflecting sunlight. So for about 35 minutes, this group of military guys just kind of stood in the tower watching this object, trying to figure out what it could be, and they're all stumped. And that's exactly when Mantell's flight happened to be passing by. Blackwell saw this as the perfect opportunity. They've got aircraft right there that could fly up and get a closer look. Blackwell gets on the radio and asks Mantell if he could check it out. And Mantell just says, yeah, he's got enough fuel. Of course he can help out. So Mantell and his 3 wingmen, they bank their planes and head in the direction Blackwell gives them. Within just a few moments, Mantell radios back that he could see something at his 12 o'clock high, meaning straight ahead and above his position. At this point, Mantell's flying at about 7,500 feet, and he says the object is bright and seems to be climbing away from him as he climbs towards it. One of Mantell's wingmen quickly decides this isn't for him. He's low on fuel and has orders to land on schedule, so he just breaks off from the pursuit. But Mantell keeps climbing, and as they pass 15,000 feet, his 2 remaining wingmen start getting worried. This is important because these F-51 fighters weren't equipped with oxygen systems for this routine flight. One of the wingmen radios Mantell and tells him he needs to level off. Do not climb any higher without oxygen. Mantell acknowledges but doesn't slow down. He's determined to get a closer look at whatever this thing is. What Mantell doesn't realize is that he's starting to experience hypoxia, which is oxygen deprivation. At first, it's just dizziness, maybe some tingling in his fingers, a slight headache, but it gets worse the higher he climbs. Around 3 p.m., another wingman abandons the chase altogether. He's running low on fuel and afraid of blacking out. Before turning back, he tells Mantell that he thinks the object might just be sunlight reflecting off something, maybe an airplane canopy, and makes one last plea for Mantell to level off, but Mantell doesn't respond. At this point, he's completely alone in this pursuit. Now, at approximately 3:15 p.m., Mantell makes his final radio call to Godman Tower. The transmission is hard to understand, but he seems to be saying the object is metallic and tremendous in size and that it's still above him. Then, in the middle of his report, his words suddenly cut off. The radio goes silent. The tower tries calling back on different channels, but there's just static. What we know now is that Mantell's cockpit clock and his wristwatch both stopped at 3:18 p.m. That's probably the exact moment when he finally lost consciousness from the lack of oxygen. His plane then went into an uncontrolled descent. Around 3:30 p.m., people in Franklin, Kentucky saw a plane spiraling down from the sky. There were no parachutes, no signs that the pilot was in control. They heard this faint explosive sound and then saw smoke rising from behind some hills. Mantell's Mustang had crashed. By 3:50 p.m., state police had confirmed to Godman Field that a military plane had crashed on a farm south of Franklin. When they examined the wreckage, there were no signs of bullet holes or anything unusual, just the kind of damage you'd expect from a plane that had fallen out of control from high altitude. Now, this incident became huge news across the country. Headlines were saying things like, "Fighter pilot dies chasing flying saucer," and it was the first really widely publicized case of a pilot actually dying during a UFO encounter. And all kinds of rumors started spreading from this. I mean, you had people that were claiming that the UFO had shot down Mantell's plane. Others had claimed that his body was missing from the wreckage. And of course, there's a lot of stories going on about radioactive debris, but none of it was true based on the actual evidence. The Air Force initially suggested Mantell might have been chasing Venus, but that doesn't make sense. Venus wouldn't look like a large metallic disk in the afternoon sky. They thought that maybe it was a weather balloon, but there weren't any reported in the area that day. And folks, it wasn't until 1952, when the Air Force's Project Blue Book investigated the case again, they figured out what Mantell was probably chasing. a Navy skyhook balloon. These were these enormous high-altitude balloons the Navy was secretly launching for research and intelligence purposes. They were reflective, very large, and flew at very high altitudes. But here's another key component. The Skyhook program was top secret at the time. Neither Mantell nor anyone at Godman Field would have known about it. To them, this balloon was truly an unidentified flying object. Unfortunately, this was a case where a brave pilot, just trying to do his duty and identify something strange in the sky, pushed himself beyond safe limits and tragically lost his life in the process. At around 5 in the morning in 2005, an anonymous Romanian military colonel was driving back to Bucharest after taking this little solo camping trip in the Renezit Mountains. The colonel later asked to keep his identity hidden when reporting all of this, which you'll understand why in a minute. So he's driving along and he notices his SUV is getting pretty low on gas. He pulls into this tiny rural gas station that's basically in the middle of nowhere. Since it's so early in the morning, there's nobody else around. The place is deserted. But as the colonel gets out of his car, he notices there's this khaki Hummer with these dark black windows just there outside the gas station. The engine's running, but there's nobody around, which he thought was kind of odd. But the colonel doesn't think too much about it at this point, and he just goes ahead and fills up his tank. The gas station is this little dingy place with just 2 pumps, one of the old school setups where the numbers still flip over mechanically instead of having a digital display. And the place smells like cigarettes and motor oil. The lights overhead are buzzing and flickering in that kind of gives you a headache if you just look at them too long. And after he's done pumping his gas, he just walks inside to pay the attendant. And the guy behind the counter is this very middle-aged man. He's kind of got a patchy beard, and he barely looks up from his newspaper when the colonel hands him the money. However, when he comes back out and he's heading to his SUV, he notices something really weird. The driver's door of that Hummer is now open, and inside, sitting in the driver's seat, the colonel doesn't really know what he's looking at. The colonel's just looking at this thing in the driver's seat, and it notices him staring. And it's this moment where time feels like it stops. His heart starts pounding. He just is looking at something that's so unexpected he can't even process it. And this thing, it can't be real. But his eyes are telling him it absolutely is. The skin of this has a weird sheen to it, like when sunlight hits a crocodile's back when it just comes out of the water. And its movements are very fluid but also kind of jerky at the same time. Nothing like how a person moves. Whatever it is gets out of the Hummer while maintaining direct eye contact with the colonel the whole time, and then it starts making these sharp sounds toward the Hummer, like it's talking to somebody else in the vehicle. It seems really irritated about something. After making these sounds, this thing just gets back into the driver's seat, and the Hummer immediately speeds away from the gas station. The colonel notices that this vehicle doesn't have any license plates, not on the front or the back. So he's standing there in complete shock, and he looks around to see if anybody else saw what he just did. But there's nobody around. His hands are shaking at this point, and he could feel this cold sweat all over his body. He's a military colonel who's been through combat, but nothing in his training has prepared him for something like this. There's got to be some kind of logical explanation. And that's when he spots a security camera. He's like, great, this was on camera, now I can make sure that I'm not crazy. So what does he do? He marches right back in and starts asking the attendant about the camera. But the guy just tells him that the camera is just for decoration, that it doesn't actually record anything. It's just there to scare off potential robbers. Now, the only conclusion that the colonel can come to is that he's being pranked. And this whole thing is some elaborate joke. So he just gets back in his SUV and, he continues driving towards his original destination. And after getting several miles down the road, he's still trying to figure out what he witnessed because he doesn't know. His knuckles are white and he's gripping the steering wheel really hard. And he suddenly spots that same Hummer again. And he has to almost double take because he's convincing himself that he's just imagining things, he's losing his mind. But no, it's definitely the same vehicle. And his first instinct is to just floor it and drive past as fast as possible. But there's this other part of him. Maybe the military training or just basic human curiosity makes him slow down instead. And that's when he sees that all 4 doors of the Hummer are wide open, like someone left in a hurry. The Colonel pulls over about 100 yards down from the Hummer, and his heart starts racing again. He's debating whether to just drive off or to investigate further, and that's when he spots them. They're on the roadside. There are 2 creatures that the Colonel could only describe as reptilian beings, and they appear to be arguing with each other. The Colonel got a really good look at these things. These aren't people in costumes. They're reptilian creatures that are basically covered with these green crocodile-like scales, and mind you, very out of place. The first one, the one he'd seen at the gas station, is wearing nothing but military boots and has this lizard-type crest on its head. The Colonel would estimate that it was about 2 meters tall, close to probably about 6 foot 7 inches, and it had these yellow eyes with vertical slits like a cat. The second one was even bigger, probably by about 20 or so centimeters, and the other most obvious difference is that this one had a tail, which the first one didn't. But wait, folks, there's more. The Colonel isn't the only one seeing these things. While this is happening, there are trucks passing by in both directions on the road, and the Colonel can see the truck drivers pointing at these things as they drive past. But strangely, despite clearly seeing these things, none of the drivers actually stop their vehicles. I mean, can you blame them? They just keep on driving. The Colonel quickly grabs his phone. It's one of those early 2000s flip phones with a pretty basic camera, and his hands are trembling so much that he nearly drops it, and he has to take a deep breath to steady himself enough to aim the camera, and he manages to take several photographs of these reptilians. 11 photographs in total, carefully framing each shot. And he zooms in as much as the grainy camera will allow, and with each photo, he's thinking that this is it. This is the proof that these things exist. The entire time, these things were completely oblivious to being photographed, like they don't even care or maybe don't understand what a camera is. And the whole scene lasts for about 3 to 5 minutes. And then both of these reptilians just get back into the Hummer and drive away at high speed, heading back in the direction they had originally come from. After they leave, the Colonel immediately checks his phone to make sure he's captured the images. When he sees that he has the photos, he rushes toward Bucharest with the specific goal of contacting General Emil Strinu, because he wants to consult with the general about what to do with this new photographic evidence. However, when the Colonel arrives in Bucharest and checks his phone again, something very strange has happened. The photos weren't deleted, don't worry. But when he opens them, all of the images just display a solid green color. It's like he somehow photographed an intense green light instead of these beings. He meets up with General Strinu, and together they review these mysterious green images. Over the next 2 weeks, they visit a phone service company to try to get a technical assistance team so that way they could recover or at least clarify the images, but this company can't help them at all. So then they conduct a detailed analysis of the entire event. They search for additional witnesses who might have seen them, trying to locate some of those truck drivers who had been on the road, but unfortunately, all of their investigation efforts ultimately end in failure. This account was actually personally investigated by Albert Rosales, who is a well-known researcher within the paranormal realm and appears in his Humanoid Encounters database. No additional witnesses ever came forward, and they couldn't recover any usable evidence from the phone. They can't find any explanation for why those photographs appear completely green. So, despite being a high-ranking military official with credibility, the Colonel is left with absolutely no concrete evidence of his experience. All he has is his testimony about what he saw, and to this day, the origin, purpose, and nature of these beings remain a complete mystery. This last story was originally shared on the YouTube channel How to Hunt, and is one of the wildest stories I've ever heard. For the record, How to Hunt is a channel that focuses on things about hunting and just very interesting stories, and this one in particular is from a retired military officer who's been corresponding with this guy who runs this YouTube, and this is the detailed account, which, by the way, is still ongoing. So all credit goes to this YouTube channel for the original story. This is my retelling. On a January afternoon in 2019, a retired military veteran was standing in the hangar of his cabin in a national forest, and he had just taken 1, 2, 3 steps when suddenly he froze in place, just completely stopped moving because something outside was staring at him through the partially open hangar doors with what felt like murderous intent. In that split second, all the hair on the back of his neck and arms stood straight up, and he got what he called his gut warning. This man had only gotten this feeling before when flying into live fire during combat, and here he was in the middle of the American wilderness getting this same sensation, but even stronger. And so, instead of just walking to the fridge like he had planned, he quickly went over to a nearby table where he'd laid out his weapons, grabbed a large gauge handgun, checked if it was loaded, stuck it in his belt, and then picked up one of his already loaded rifles. With both weapons, he then advanced toward the hangar doors, raised his rifle, and started looking through the scope, swinging it left and right, carefully scanning. But it was already pretty dark outside, so he could only make out vague tree shapes and bushes. And suddenly, as he swung the rifle to the right, that intense feeling of being watched just switched off, like somebody had flipped a light switch. But how he even got to this point is pretty interesting. His cabin was very remote, like 50 miles up a dirt road at a very high elevation in the western United States. Most years, you can't even get to this location around Thanksgiving all the way through Labor Day because there's just too much snow and ice. But on this particular January, the weather was so unusual that there wasn't any snow. And since it's so rare to be able to visit the cabin in January, he and his friend decided to take advantage and go up there for New Year's Eve. They'd figured they'd stay for about a week, and if snow started falling while they were there, they could just quickly get out before the road became impassable. Simple enough, right? So they'd driven up from the city and got around to the cabin about midday, and the weather was pretty decent enough, though there were a few inches of snow on the ground when they arrived. And Phil, the veteran, was always on alert for animal tracks. He immediately checked the snow around the cabin, and he found bear prints, deer prints, cougar prints, and tracks he couldn't exactly identify. Not knowing what they were, he simply figured, you know what, it's probably bear tracks or something. It was probably just distorted in the snow, whatever. And after checking these tracks, together they started powering up the cabin, turning on the electricity, the water, the gas. And now, the way this cabin was constructed is interesting. It had living quarters on one side and a huge garage with 2 aircraft-style hangar doors. Phil unlocked those doors and then opened them about 6 feet wide so they could unload all their supplies from his Jeep. Once they had got everything properly set up and cleaned, Phil laid out all the weapons he'd brought on this large table in the hangar and went through each of them thoroughly, cleaning them, loading them. And he even stocked up his high gas-powered fridge he kept in the hangar with food that needed to be kept cold. So fast forward to the afternoon, and at this point, Phil and his friend were just sitting inside the cabin having conversation about how lucky they were with the weather, having a drink or two and telling stories of their time in service. And during this conversation, Phil noticed that it was starting to get darker in the cabin and looked out the window to see the sun setting behind the mountains. He asked his friend if he was hungry and that he'd go and get some steaks from the fridge in the hangar for dinner. He'd be right back. which takes us to the point this story started off. And after that strange episode where he felt like something was watching him, he spent a few moments at the hangar door just scanning the wood line, waiting for anything. But after a few moments of not seeing anything out of the ordinary, what could he do? He shrugged it off, grabbed the stakes, and went back inside. Now keep in mind that he'd had this cabin for years, and he had never experienced this before, like ever. And at this point, it had not turned dangerous enough to warrant him leaving. So, later that night, after dinner, Phil grabbed one of his weapons, opened the cabin door, and just stood there in the doorway. And as soon as he did this, that feeling of being watched came right back. Although it wasn't as intense as it was the first time, it was definitely noticeable. And just like before, he sat there, waiting and watching for anything. After some time, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, the feeling just shut off again. Now, for the rest of that evening, he just couldn't get a peace of mind. It's like whatever happened robbed him of that. He just kept turning this sequence of events over and over, trying to figure it out, but he couldn't. Now, about the same time as he'd finished dinner is when he just decided it was probably a bear and there's nothing to worry about. Now, as it got later at night, Phil and his friend both agreed that they were tired and they should hit the sack. Fortunately, they were able to sleep through the night without any incidents. The next morning, they did their usual routines, right? Shower, shave, have a cup of coffee, just sit out in the carport. And Phil is about halfway through his cup of cowboy coffee, and he's in conversation with his friend, and he starts to notice that prickle on his neck coming right back. It was very strange. And it was also the weakest it had ever been, it was coming from a distance. It wasn't alarming enough for him to stop mid-conversation, to scan his surroundings. But after a few more moments of conversation, he just got quiet and then explained that for the remainder of their stay up there, they would be staying close to the cabin. He did not tell his friend about the experiences he'd had up until this point, despite them being minor. He followed up by saying that he was really concerned about all the bear scat he saw around the shed and just wanted to be safe. His friend agreed. Now, not that much happened for the next few days. Other than Phil getting that passing sensation on and off again. Nothing ever came of it. It was all very strange. And every time he opened the cabin door at night and stood there looking out, that feeling would always return, and it was powerful. Like whatever was causing it was really close by. Something else that I found interesting about this is that he owned a pair of Generation 3 military night vision goggles. And so every time he was outside, he would put these on, and just like that, the feeling would switch off. This happened time and time again. Now, the entire situation was just getting so bizarre because not only had this never happened, but it couldn't be explained in any rational way. All he knew was to stick to his training. And if he had a plan, they would be okay. So the procedure he settled on was very simple. Don't go outside at night. Don't leave any doors open. Stay close to the cabin at all times. And most importantly, keep yourself armed with extra firearms close by. Never go anywhere alone. Now, by this point, they'd been there for roughly 4 days, and Phil was starting to feel more comfortable with the entire situation. It didn't take long for him to realize that whoever this watcher was also following a set of rules. They, whoever they were, stayed a certain distance from the cabin. They made no noise, and at night came closer, but not close enough to reveal their identity. It also seemed to be aware, or they seemed to be aware, when he was using his night vision goggles. Strange. Phil's friend was starting to get a little stir-crazy at this point and insisted that they go on a hike. Figuring he would bend the rules a little bit, he sensed this as a great opportunity to scout and figure out who this person was. Since they were traveling together, they were both well-armed and watching things from a distance, they would be okay. They agreed that his friend would hike down the dirt road for a short distance and then come back. Phil's friend got all ready, grabbing all the supplies needed, and just excited to step away from the cabin for a bit. Phil, on the other hand, was a little more focused on arming himself heavily. He holstered and put a large bore revolver on each hip, double-checked the load on his AR-15, and slung it in front of him. Then, at the last moment, for some reason, he also slung his old trusty full auto machine gun on his back. Phil's friend took off, and he watched as his friend walked down the cabin access road to the main dirt road. And as soon as his friend was out of sight, the veteran just jogged over to a knoll that had a commanding view of the road and the entire valley. And he worked his way into some old growth bushes. And from there, he watched as his friend started walking down the road. And within seconds, he saw a large bear just off the road behind his friend. Immediately, he locks in and his training kicks in. However, within a few seconds of watching this bear, he notices things aren't making any sense. It's much larger than any other bear he's previously seen, and it's also shaped differently. And he could see that now because of how it's moving in and out of the brush to get behind his friend, who it's clearly stalking, and his friend still doesn't notice. It's like all the details of this animal kind of just hit Phil at once, and as things are playing out in real time, he just begins to take in more details. What he described and what he saw was big and black and stood upright on two legs, and it was fast. And it had this weird flippy, floppy, zigzagging gait, but it zipped from tree to tree incredibly quickly, following his friend as he walked. In an instant, this man knew that this thing was the Watcher that had been spying on them all week, and it was definitely not a bear he was looking at. So he raised his rifle and, tried to see through the scope. His first glimpse was of its head and upper body, and this thing clearly had the head of a dog. A little stunned, he suddenly remembered his training and lowered his rifle sight to its legs. And what he saw were these huge, muscular legs, like the ones you'd see on an Olympic heavyweight lifter. Its short, dense black fur became sparse going down to its feet, and the toes had these huge curved talons, not nails. They weren't quite as big as, like a velociraptor or anything like that from Jurassic Park, but they were almost as big and looked incredibly lethal. All he could do to take this in was just pull his rifle back up to sight on its head and chest, and he realized that it was staring back at him from about 100 yards away. And he got a good look at it as it stared back at him. Its head was huge, much bigger than a person's. It had short, smooth black fur and a huge jaw that was slightly parted. And in it, he could see large white canine teeth in its mouth. Its eyes were deep, dark red, and as he watched, it started to squint its eyes and really got a good look at him. The longer he looked at it, it looked back at him, and his brain just tried to compare it to other dogs he'd seen in his life. To him, in his head, it resembled a cross between a German Shepherd and a Black Lab, but of course was just absolutely huge. And he got a sense that this thing was mean and pretty pissed off. Instinctively, he decided to shoot it. Just as he put his finger on the trigger and was about to pull, he was interrupted by the noise of a vehicle coming up the dirt road off in the distance. And so he stopped sighting on the beast for an instant, looked down the road, and then swung his gaze back to this thing, but it was gone. So he lowered his rifle and scanned for it, and then he saw something he couldn't believe. It was running away, faster than anything he'd ever seen run, and it ran through the trees so fast it was kind of like a blur just running on two legs. Then it burst out of the tree line, went down to all fours, and actually increased its speed. And it started going through a boulder field and then took off upslope at such a speed that he just said out loud to himself, "You've got to be kidding me, nothing runs that fast." And he watched as it got to the steep granite mountainside across the valley and just went straight up it, seemingly floating over the rock. It was so fast it was gone in seconds. Now, the vehicle coming up the road turned out to be a U.S. Forest Service Jeep with a ranger inside. The ranger stopped and actually talked to Phil's friend down the road, and Phil, where he was at, watched as they chatted. Eventually, his friend finished talking and the ranger drove off and started hiking back to the cabin. At this point, Phil was already headed back and was really starting to worry about what was going to happen. Not only did he have no idea what he was dealing with, but he didn't know how dangerous this new threat was. So by the time his friend returned, it was late in the day, and Phil told him they'd be leaving the next day. Now, obviously, Phil walked around outside the cabin heavily armed after that, and the rest of the day remained fairly common without any issues. Well, a little while later, Phil noticed the ranger and his Jeep parked down at his access road gate. And so he walked in there to chat as he'd recognized this ranger who he'd known for about 10 years or so. And during a pause in the conversation, Phil just flat out asked him, "Hey, have you ever seen or heard of reports of any huge dog running around this area?" And the ranger looked at him very oddly and very coldly and just said, "We don't talk about that stuff." Without another word, he started his Jeep and drove off as Phil was basically in the middle of saying, "What do you mean? What's going on?" Phil looked back up the road thinking to himself, just what the heck is going on? It's never been like this before. And then he walked back to the cabin. That evening, Phil felt pretty checked out. Even though his friend, who was completely unaware of what was going to happen to him earlier in the day, had the animal not noticed Phil, was just going on and on about how amazing the hike was, that it felt so good to get some fresh air. But Phil just couldn't really concentrate. He was quiet. The events of this entire vacation had really bothered him. And after some time and forced conversation from Phil, he decided to call it a night and attempt to get some sleep. But I mean, come on, who could get a full night of rest with what had just happened during the day? He didn't sleep much, no surprise there, and it wasn't great, but he was so happy to see the sunlight in the morning. And for the first time in years, he was glad to be leaving the cabin that day. However, folks, he had no idea what was about to come. After some stretching and a few moments of meditation to calm his mind, Phil and his friend had some breakfast. The plan was that afterwards, they would pack up, pack a cold lunch for the drive back home, and start cleaning the cabin, shutting everything off, And after eating a big breakfast, they got to work on closing up the cabin when Phil and his friend both stopped and listened. They could hear dogs barking in the distance. Phil immediately knew what this was. Poachers, also known as dog runners, and basically, these guys bring dogs to track down bears, follow them on dirt bikes, and when the dogs trap the bears, the poachers shoot them, take the paws and gallbladders, and leave the rest to rot. And so when he heard these dogs and dirt bikes in the distance, he called the closest ranger station on his satellite phone. They just told Phil that they'd send some rangers in the area, but that wasn't good enough to save whatever bear the dog runners were after right then and there. So Phil took out his .357 and he fired a shot into the ground. Now that must have did something because in the distance, he could hear the dogs stop barking for a moment before resuming. He then fired the remaining 5 rounds as quickly as he could. And that time, they all stopped barking and the dirt bikes stopped racing around. He quickly reloaded and fired another 6 rounds. After that, he heard shouting from the dirt bikers and it sounded like they were headed back to wherever they came from, probably their vehicles. Now, about a half hour later, his satellite phone rang and the ranger on the other end announced proudly that they had caught these people. And they thanked Phil profusely and asked him to stop at the station on the way home just to make a statement. So the 2 men were sitting in their folding chairs in the carport discussing what had just happened with these runners when things got really weird. Remember, they were still packing up, getting ready to go. And as if the week hadn't been weird enough already, all of a sudden they heard this soft sound, like a very faint musical talking. It was very soft, very seductive, with little tweets and clicks and what sounded like little bells and whistles. It was the kind of noise that just begs to be followed and investigated because it was so beautiful, and you just have to know what's making it. Phil would later refer to it as fairy music. Then it started coming from the north, then the west. And at that point, they got up from their chairs, walked over to the west side of the cabin, and the sound started coming from the south. Now they realized it was all around them. Phil's friend was like, "We need to go see what's making this beautiful music." But something inside Phil just snapped, and he's like, "Absolutely not. We're being lured into something." And he fired his revolver into the forest to the west. And the instant he fired, the fairy music ended. He got that instinctive gut feeling warning in him that something was really wrong and that they had to avoid it. By that time, he'd had enough of all these shenanigans and flat out told his friend that they needed to leave now. So they double timed it, finished packing the Jeep, and got ready to leave. And they sat for one last time in the folding chairs, just looking out to the east and at the forest and down the hill to the dirt road. And all of a sudden, a loud whine started from down in the direction of the road. It was very loud, echoing around the valley, and it sounded like a huge dog in mortal, life-threatening pain, like it was dying right then and there. It didn't stop. It just went on and on. And then it changed to this howl of rage that went on and morphed into an all-out roar of furious, just pent-up frustration, and finally ended with an abrupt yelp. Phil had his handgun out the instant the howl started, and as it ended and the echo began dying around them, he fired one round towards the road. Another howl started up to the north of them, a little less loud from a further distance away. He then fired another shot in that direction, and it stopped mid-howl. Another howl started to the south, also further away, and he turned and shot in that direction. The howl stopped. There were 3 of them. 3 dogmen. A pack of them, and they had the men pretty much surrounded. All of a sudden, his friend just said, "That sounds like a dogman." And Phil turned to him and said, "What the heck is a dogman?" But he realized the instant that he spoke that dogman was its name, or at least the name people give to this creature. So they rapidly got in the Jeep and just left, and nothing else happened on the long ride back down this dirt road. And eventually, when Phil got back to the city, he curiously looked up what a dogman was and didn't really find much information, but since much more information has come out about what this thing is and how there's just hordes of encounters with these things. After being hunted by a small pack of these things for an entire week in the remote wilderness of the western United States, Phil has come to some conclusions about what this is. It's absolutely real, and he thinks this is how werewolf legends got started, that all legends begin with a kernel of truth somewhere, and dogman appears to be at the top of the food chain in the wilderness, the apex predator on land, much like the great white sharks or orca killer whales are in the ocean. The dogman is almost completely unknown by mankind, and not exactly an animal. It's obviously not a human, it's something in between. It's incredibly intelligent and able to strategize and plot. The fact that it waited for him for an entire week and just observed his habits and the timing and behaviors and really studied him before it made its move. That's not only pretty terrifying, but if that's not an alpha predator, I don't know what is. Phil believes that dogman isn't evil just because it's a predator and preys on other animals. It's evil because it can plot and plan to kill, as it did with him and his friend for an entire week. It didn't need them for meat or sustenance. Anything that kills for so small a reason, simply because it can, is evil. However, the identity of whatever creature, animal, something that he saw in the woods, the strange fairy music, and just all the bizarre events that happened will remain a mystery. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to comment below military mysteries, so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.